Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first day of the Virtual Medical School Fair. My name is Laura. I'm with the AAMC, and let's just give it another 30 seconds or so. We're still seeing attendees coming into the Zoom, so I just want to wait until we fully get started. Okay, it looks like a little over 200 people and climbing. So again, welcome everyone. We are so excited for the Spring Virtual Medical School Fair. My name is Laura, and the session that we are kicking off with today is going to cover strategies to help you mitigate your anxiety all throughout the medical school application process. We'll also cover some strategies related to improving your performance on standardized tests, and we'll also cover how to handle nerves during interviews. So if you've ever struggled with procrastination, avoidance, fears of failure, or perfectionism, this session is definitely for you. Before I go ahead and introduce Dr. Hunter, I just want to share a couple housekeeping items. The session will be recorded. The recording will be available in the auditorium of the virtual fair platform approximately 24 hours after the live session. We will be doing a live audience Q&A towards the end of the session, but at any time that a question pops into your head, feel free to put that in the Q&A box. We also, I believe we have emojis enabled, and feel free to get into the conversation via the chat at any point. Now I'm going to switch it over, give you a 30-second intro of Dr. Hunter. Dr. Rosie Hunter is a licensed psychologist with over 15 years of expertise in anxiety and performance under pressure. She also has experience with a combat deployment as a psychologist in the United States Army. So welcome, Dr. Hunter.
Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I am glad to be here again this year to support future physicians in this very daunting process. I hope to offer a chock-full session this morning to help you think about tips and tricks and just sort of ways to approach your test prep and your application process in a way that are anxiety resistant. So we're going to go fast, we're going to break things, and again, I'm glad to be here. I am a psychologist by trade. I am not a motivational speaker. I'm sort of an academic and a behavioral scientist, and now I do some entrepreneurial things as the founder of TestWolf, but we will still need your patience as I click through this, right? But first, before we launch into any kind of traditional webinar didactic, let's do what the topic says to do, which is face some standardized testing. And I appreciate Laura saying that you are welcome to do the Q&A in the chat or the actual Q&A function. Feel free to do that at any time. So let's dive right into a multiple choice style question. I want you to think about being an expert in anxiety and someone needing your help. Okay, let's imagine Ellen has been preparing for the MCAT for 4 months, a little over 350 hours. So she's right in that range of what they tell you you need to do. She's gotten a lot of good support from her pre-med advisors and resources. She has outside resources that she can afford. One of those super test prep guaranteed score kind of deals. And she's taken some full-length practice tests and is scoring within her goal score to submit a strong application. So you're the anxiety expert. She comes to you because, and I'm going to ask you what you should do with this, by the way. So listen to the particulars. 3 weeks ago, she was working on cars, like, the sort of notorious, most stressful part of things. And she noticed her heart racing, some sweating during some just regular practice question blocks. 2 weeks ago, she had a full-blown panic attack during her last planned practice test and had to actually go to urgent care. And now she's coming to you, scheduled to take the MCAT in 2 weeks, recognizing this is anxiety since she's been to urgent care. They said your heart's good. What are you going to do for her as an expert in anxiety, an expert in test anxiety? I'm going to give you some multiple choice answers in the true MCAT fashion, single patient kind of vignette with some multiple choice after it. Here are your options. And I want you, when you have an option that you like, go ahead and put it in the chat. Go ahead and commit to what you would do if you could do one thing for this student who may be a little bit where you are in life. You can prescribe a mild medication to relieve anxiety, something that sort of sits on that autonomic nervous arousal, and tell her to take it and 10 minutes before she arrives at the testing center on test day. So go take the test. Here's a little something to sit on that old nervous system. You can tell her to keep studying, plan to take it, and plan to use some grounding techniques. So if you feel anxious, you can take a break, go to the bathroom, splash some water on your face, practice some deep breathing, and then return to the test. Option C, you can explain, as the expert in anxiety, the autonomic nervous system and tell her about the thoughts that are contributing to this catastrophic kind of thinking, and give her some tricks. Like if you're having a heart attack, you can't walk around. So for example, how can you challenge those catastrophic thoughts? Or D, you can teach her to intentionally overbreathe to elicit the sort of physical discomfort for 10 minutes daily and before and during some additional practice test, and keep going and take the test. Option E, and you may have noticed in the kind of intro summary, Ellen is on the ball, right? She's going to be a little bit early in the process if she's trying to take it now. She's trying to get her scores for that May 27th first submittal. She wants to be an early applicant to her favorite med school. She wants to get on the desk of those admissions folks first, but she's got time. So you can recommend that she keeps studying, postpones the exam a month to explore the test, what the test symbolizes, explore perfectionism, get to the root of things. So now make some commitments in the chat. What would you recommend if you're an anxiety expert and you have to help out this student reduce anxiety, help her succeed? I see lots of D's. Oh, E's. We're on a streak of E's. We're on a streak of B's. Some D's sprinkled in. Okay, I like it. Definitely B. That went by fast. Somebody just dropped the B word, burnout, into the chat. Yeah, this person has definitely been on their grind. Okay, so all over the place, these answers, right? You guys like a lot of different options, and that's because they are all within the realm of reason, all something that you've heard before. We're going to come back to it. I am not going to, this is a cliffhanger for now, but we're going to come back to it. So I believe that, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, that everyone can become an expert in their own anxiety, and that there are key principles that will allow you to adapt what we know from the evidence from CBT about what works for anxiety. You can adapt it to the test. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. I am going to be making sure that you have the foundational understanding, and then the expertise in your own life is what you will apply to that foundational understanding to get ahead of the MCAT and to get some power back in your admissions process. This talk is for everyone, right? You don't have to experience test anxiety or be overly nervous about the admissions process to benefit from these tips. So we'll get there. Let's start out with some foundational understanding of anxiety. And so I call this Anxiety 101. You may be asking yourself, why am I so nervous about this? Why do I feel so much pressure? Why does anyone have anxiety at all? The answer is because the people who weren't anxious, who weren't skittish, are not our ancestors. We inherited the brains of the most skittish folks who were able to keep themselves alive when a saber-toothed tiger popped out. They said, up, their brain didn't pause to understand what that was. It just skedaddled, right? Those are our ancestors. So when we talk about anxiety, it is so important to understand that, especially in performance situations, when we can imagine that it matters and it's not something we do often, we have a hardwired sort of physiological relationship to our experiences. So anxieties, the gift of anxiety is that fight or flight. Some people say fight or flight or freeze response, right? If you've been studying for the MCAT, you know a lot more about the chemicals and hormones in this system and how we can downregulate our digestion and how fast all of these things happen because of the messengers in our body, right? That fight, flight, or freeze response has kept us alive for many, many millennia, right? This is why we're here. It's a fear-related gift that is the cave brain. I always say, I'm sure you all are studying the brain development and how that old part of the brain is back there. It does it for us. So in the process of activating a fight or flight response, we are activating huge muscle groups to be able to get away from the saber-toothed tiger. We are trying to oxygenate our brains, so we might need to overbreathe to do that. We end up having symptoms. And these are the kinds of symptoms that you can have if you are having some kind of fight, flight, or freeze response, some kind of arousal response related to fear. Heart palpitations, dizziness, sweating, indigestion. You'll never see me in a gray shirt giving a talk like this because I'm an armpit sweater. Everybody's anxiety comes up with its own kind of thing, right? You may know something that you sense when you're sitting down to take a test, sweaty palms, that jittery leg. You may know what your particular brand is. It's generally derivative from this fight, flight, or freeze response. The second gift from fear that we enjoy is the power to anticipate future threats. And I'm just going to be going on and off kind of like this, right? So the thing that makes us human and our big frontal lobes is this ability to say, that was a scary saber-toothed tiger. I don't want to be eaten by it, so I'm going to take these preventative measures. And oh, by the way, I could actually worry about my distant family members who haven't even been born yet being eaten by that same saber-toothed tiger, right? If I'm walking around with my cat and the saber-toothed tiger jumps out, my cat's not going to worry about his grandkitties getting eaten by the same saber-toothed tiger, although he might have that fight or flight response, right? So we have this power to anticipate future threats. So two really important things to remember about those two things is that they are gifts, and we are truly hardwired to react to stimulus in our environment, to challenges with these kinds of responses. So what does that mean? We are hardwired to pay attention to autonomic arousal related to anxiety, to our worries as well. And chances are, if you're up this morning on this call, you care about your future. So the part of your brain that anticipates the future may even be more active on average, right? And you've been dining out on that with your good college grades and your ability to, decide on a career that takes a decade. So the good parts of it also come with this hardwiring. Pay attention to anxiety, respond to it to avoid threat, and to push for and prefer certainty. That's that part about anticipating the future. So these three things are not things that we want to go away, right? When Ellen comes to us and she's having this concern about the MCAT, we have to also hold in mind that we don't want to get rid of, and we also can't get rid of, the hardwiring that is the infrastructure of anxiety. Okay, so if that's the infrastructure of anxiety, if that's the sort of origin source, if that's the driving kind of why, what are the things that we actually experience? We experience generally four categories of things: our thoughts, our ideas, our physical sensations, and often our thoughts are about these things, and our behaviors. So just a note about physical sensations. Difficulty concentrating is an important thing if you're being hunted by a predator, right? If you are laser focused in your cave on building your fire and the saber-toothed tiger comes and your attention doesn't move all around, you're going to die, right? So when we have that difficulty concentrating in test taking, it's important to remember that there is a situation in which it's adaptive. It's just not that situation, and we'll talk about that. Oh, okay, pop quiz. DJ Khaled, and I sometimes date myself by putting Dolly Parton or Aretha Franklin up here, or John Madden even. All of these celebrities have something in common, and that is a specific behavioral strategy related to fear and anxiety. So We have thoughts, physical sensations, and behaviors. Behaviors amount to avoidance. So DJ Khaled was afraid to fly for years. Did anybody know that? And he was driving around to his gigs for a long time, so afraid to fly that he was putting his child on the plane and driving in the bus to meet the plane there, right? So this is not, we know that this is sort of separated from um, the kind of logistical world of did he believe he was going to die, because he's putting his kid on there. But the aversion that anxiety creates in us by design is so strong that we engage in avoidance behaviors. And often they save our lives. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just cost us a lot of impairment. And this is an extreme example, but I put this up to make the point, and this is about how as soon as he got over that fear of flying, he got to more gigs and suddenly made tons more money. When we talk about anxiety in the DSM, right, the diagnosis of anxiety, when we talk about the phenomenon of anxiety in the behavioral science world, we're talking about the behavioral impairment coming from avoidance, right? Anxiety, thoughts and fears are just thoughts. Physical sensations are designed to keep us safe. They aren't inherently dangerous. You cannot outright die from a panic attack itself because it's designed to be quick. And when the saber-toothed tiger doesn't eat you or doesn't show up, it's designed to go down, right? So where does the impairment come from? It comes from all the little ways, and people are amazing and idiosyncratic, all the little ways that we attempt to avoid not just the feared outcome, but the anxiety itself. So in test taking, that can look like skipping or rushing decisions. That can look like taking tons of breaks to sort of make the physiological anxiety go down, and then you run out of time on a section, on a section. That can look like postponing the exam or avoiding the exam, or just changing even your profession, right, to avoid the experience of anxiety. So in treatment of anxiety, when it's at a clinical level, but even when it's subclinical, we want to target the behavioral avoidance because that's what's sending the cue to our hindbrain, to our old brain, that we need to stay vigilant and avoid this thing, that something's dangerous. Okay, so let's talk specifically about test anxiety. Now that we have that foundation, some things about anxiety you may have heard, we're on the same page. Test anxiety is not just a problem because it can make you miserable. Although, for me, the idea that people are white knuckling it through their careers or even changing their careers because of test anxiety makes me really, really sad, especially given the shortage of healthcare folks. But test anxiety is a problem because it can affect your performance, right? It means that how much you know, how much effort you put in, how you approach the exam minus anxiety can be an actual more accurate way to predict your score than just those first three things alone, which is what we think we're doing. By the way, I put some of these little camera icons up here for slides that I think once we get to the end of it, you might want to take a screenshot of if you want that. So how do we know, how can you tell right now in your practice test that test anxiety might be on board? Because all of you are considering all the time, is this a knowledge deficit or is this anxiety, right? That's the thing that we think about when you're a driven student. That's the thing you've probably heard from the sort of pre-med folks who support you. And that's something that we sort of assume about standardized testing, that it is about your ability to learn things. And when you don't do well, you don't know things. But here's some ways to look at your QBanks data and some of your practice test data to determine if test anxiety might be on board and might be driving some of your outcomes. So one way to identify test anxiety is something sort of classic: right answers change to wrong answers, right? There's something in your brain that works past the point of good judgment into this point of sort of self-soothing, and you start kind of changing answers. That's one way to see it. I call this slumming. This is a nuanced term, but some of your resources that you access to prepare for the MCAT will tell you the percentage of people who took that same item and the percentage of people who selected each answer choice, right? So often for questions, the majority of people select the right answer, but not all the time. Sometimes the majority of people select some combination of the other answers, right? And so there might be a 40% answer, a 20% answer, a 3% answer, and a 2% answer. And if you're constantly finding that even though you've studied an area, you feel confident in it, every once in a while you don't choose the second best answer, which is also known as wrong, but it's still the second best, right? You want to be wrong in the right way. You're actually choosing something that like 2% or 3% of people would choose that, right? And you look back at the item and you can't really figure out why you got it wrong. I call it slumming. But that low base rate response choices tend to suggest that anxiety interfered in your decision-making process, especially later on in your studying. I call it the United Nations of flaggings. There's flags everywhere, just like the United Nations building in New York. You're flagging everything, not even because you're going to get back to it, but because it makes you feel good to sort of leave it open. That's a telltale sign of test anxiety. In a test like the MCAT, which is pretty tight, right? The timing, even for efficient test takers, is pretty tight. And so flagging more than a handful of questions on a section is not, it's not likely to be a strategy that actually yields results. And for reasons I may get into later, flagging requires your brain to do a bit more when you re-enter those questions, including on questions that are sort of paragraph based. So you want to leave it all on the field the first time you approach an item. And if you flag a lot, that's evidence that you're not really doing that. Okay, so we're going to come back to those in just a second. The thing to remember about these sort of evolutionary basis of anxiety is that anxiety cares about you. Anxiety does not care about, and actually this says step one, anxiety does not care about step one. I do a lot of work with med school students on that first board exam, but anxiety does not care about the MCAT. It's an existential kind of threat. Your brain is hardwired to keep you safe from the saber-toothed tiger, right? So when anxiety is on board, it wants to limit your ability to sit and focus on just one thing, because that's dangerous in the cave days. Anxiety also wants to prioritize anxiety reduction over other goals. So even though you want to do well, you want to finish the section, you want to go to med school, anxiety says, or maybe you just want to get out of this room, right? The other thing, and this is where we come into a lot of our test strategy, is anxiety wants to push for certainty, right? It would rather know something bad or something at all than to tolerate the uncertainty required to take a standardized test like the MCAT. So given these conflicting goals over here from what anxiety wants us all to do as human species and what is required of the test, this is the kind of outcomes that we have when test anxiety really derails our performance. Distraction, confusion, and reading comprehension issues. You read that paragraph over and over again, and it may as well have been, in the lady from Peanuts the first time. Like, you have to go back and back and back. Things that once made sense stop making sense. Skipping, bailing out, or delaying questions, right? Trying to figure out if you can, if this is a hard or easy question, can I figure this out? Early on, it sounds like, have I studied this yet? Is this one of my good areas? I can't figure this out. Your brain actually wants to hear things like that, even though on the test it turns out to be often inaccurate about whether or not you can actually increase your chances of getting it right. Excess and unplanned breaks, a little more obvious, but a little less obvious are these things that happen when we're pushing for certainty. So spontaneous introduction of irrelevant information. That's a fancy way of saying you're mind reading the test taker, the test creator, right? They would never ask that, right? You're introducing information that is not about the item in front of you. It is about pet theories, about would they ask this twice? If they ever ask this, is it always pain? All kinds of different spontaneous information that is not directly answering the question, but it influences how you answer the question. And I've heard it all. People think C is a more common answer. That's not true for modern standardized tests and tests that are developed by committee and not an individual person. There's no likelihood of a longer answer choice being right or a none of the above being more or less right. the test creators and the test writers are much more sophisticated than that. Each individual item also has to prove its value to be on a real MCAT. So introducing information like that probably helped in high school, right? You could actually do that kind of thing for your, your history teacher's test he's been using for years. It doesn't work on standardized test. And then biased information processing. A lot of folks like to read answer choices first. If you experience test anxiety, please don't do that, because your brain is going to start to drive for certainty by getting attached to one or the other answer, and then will actually interpret the information to fit that answer. And again, the tests are well written. So there's going to be a distractor, at least, that if you really wanted it to make it make sense, you can make it make sense. So there are little habits that can reduce these risks, and I'm going to describe some of those in detail. But paying attention to not systematically introducing bias in how you make your decisions is super important. And then again, excess flagging and reviewing. So even in your test prep process, some people get bogged down when they take practice tests by spending too much time reviewing the items that they got wrong, and or the subject areas for individual items that they may have gotten wrong. So a lot of people will converge on an answer and then just keep going over it and over it and over it. And even if they don't talk themselves out of it, there's a cost to that on a test that goes by quickly. So these things, then I'll add a couple of others. Answering questions that weren't asked. You're never going to come across a question that says, is this one of your strong subject areas? Right? Or did you get the previous question wrong? Or do you think this is a hard question? All of those are things that we do while we're taking tests. There's sort of storytelling that we get engaged in, but that storytelling is test anxiety at work. It's not actually giving you any kind of advantage. Anticipating questions that won't be asked. So I coach individual students who are taking all kinds of different tests. I'm in love with the LSAT right now, but I was working with someone on the MCAT the other day. And this happens a little bit too on step one on board exams as well. When you start reading the STEM or the information that's given, and on the MCAT, that's the paragraph that you know you're going to get a couple of questions about, you really try to understand everything about it, and you're almost trying to anticipate what they could ask about it before you move on to the questions that are going to come up next, right? And remember, if a passage is even one paragraph, the number of multiple choice questions that you could get about it, thousands, hundreds. I mean, I don't know, factorial this, factorial that. You cannot learn, you can't figure out what they're going to ask before you get to the question. That doesn't mean you shouldn't read the question first. In order to answer that first question about the paragraph, you can read the paragraph, right? But then when you get to the next question, you're going to still have to go back to the paragraph to begin with. So this seeking the reassurance of processing the paragraph before you know the questions can be anxiety at work. Now, if you feel like your study time is useful, should include a certain amount of looking at Reddit and TikTok and whatever for some good kind of cheat codes, right? Like, how do you know if something is an experimental question? Or how do you know from the way the computer acts whether you should void the test? Actually, the nursing exam, the NCLEX, there's a lot of ways that people try to guess whether or not they passed by trying to re-register for the test. And there's all kinds of subreddits on the subject. And nurses love to get engaged in that stuff. If you find yourself doing a lot of that and it makes it, and you're feeling like you're preparing, that is test anxiety at work. Trying to manufacture something that feels like an advantage to reduce uncertainty. So we're so quirky. We all have things like that we do. We have some ways we can see it objectively in our resources, but we're all very, very different in the ways that anxiety functions in our brain, which is what makes anxiety great, right? It's very idiosyncratic. And it's as funny as you are, it's as fast as you are, it's as dry as you are. And so you can and should be your own expert in how anxiety is affecting your MCAT prep, and how anxiety is affecting your interviews, and how anxiety is generally affecting your approach to the process. have hypotheses, and test them based on what you're learning about anxiety. So there are 2 steps to stop anxiety from stopping you. So this last half of the talk, we're going to talk about what to actually do about it. I think the next 5 to 10 minutes will be the most concrete instructional, here's test strategy stuff. So CBT, if you've heard this phrase, cognitive behavioral therapy, I'm sure it'll come up on somebody's MCAT, right? So we're doing very meta things right now. The C is to challenge and choose your thoughts, or otherwise known as cognitions, the cognitive part. The B, the behavioral part, is to take action to reduce the things that are reinforcing anxiety. So I call it develop and deploy your action plan, but this is basically CBT. So let's start with the B, because for anxiety, the B is huge, right? Because anxiety is driven by the cave brain, and the cave brain doesn't talk to us directly. The cave brain reasons backwards from the way that we act to determine what's dangerous and what will kill us. So if you're thinking about and acting towards anything related to the MCAT, like it is a saber-toothed tiger, your brain will maintain this discomfort and uncertainty, sort of overwhelm related to the MCAT. You can probably white knuckle your way through it, but the goal of CBT for test anxiety is to convince that brain that you don't need to white knuckle because you're not going to die. This is not a saber-toothed tiger. One of the reasons I like doing CBT for test anxiety is because when I ask people to do exposure, I know for sure they are not going to, it's not harmful, right? I've been in the military. I've done all kinds of scary exposures. I've worked with a lot of folks. A full-length practice test hasn't killed anybody yet, knock on wood. Okay, so behavioral approaches, and actually, oh, look, quick question. Would you advise against anticipating questions while reading the passage based on high yield content you've come across? I don't, if your brain's going to naturally start to do that, to sort of kind of anticipate what the passage is saying and where it's going. I actually think that there's an argument for reading and it's called the lead-in sometimes, and then reading the passage of that first question so that you're starting to target your brain. And you save a lot of time when you do that. So the lead-in is the prompt. It says, what is the main point of this passage, right? So if you read that before you actually read the passage, you're going to be just experiencing the information in a different way. So trying to guess what the question is going to be, if you can see a question, might put yourself at a disadvantage. Okay, effective simulations are the key to talking to the cave brain. So that means your practice test, your question blocks. And I know that there are plenty of schedules that you will get from really good test prep programs, really expensive ones, or the awesome free ones like Khan Academy, that will have you start taking full-length practice test somewhere in the middle of your 3 or 4 month journey, right? Or even longer than that. The strong recommendation if you experience test anxiety is to start to replicate the test taking conditions as early in your studying as possible, right? Don't treat yourself like you have to start putting up amazing full-length practice test numbers because you just don't want to see a low number. It's much more important for you to practice being uncomfortable and sitting there for 6, 7 hours without your cell phone, with the proper breaks, with some timing, approaching the questions in the same way every time. That's much more important of an experience from a test anxiety and execution perspective. And you don't want to send yourself the message that you have to see perfect scores in order to take a practice test. So what are you doing when you're taking a practice test if you're not just trying to get the best score? You're trying to replicate the conditions of the actual test as closely as possible. And this means in your test strategy. So if you're taking a full-length practice test and you're flagging items because you want to go back and review them at the end, you want to quit doing that because you're not going to be able to do that on test day, right? You're not going to flag items on test day to go back and review. So you want to make sure that you're creating simulations where your behavior, your brain's behavior, your hands are actually like you intend to behave on the test. Oh, look, a visitor. You want to replicate the conditions in the environment. Do not lay around on your bed, taking practice tests on your laptop, and then have to go sit up all day at a Pearson Center. Pearson won't let you in there necessarily to take practice tests, but you can sure find a cubicle that has probably some hard headsets if you're going to use them on your campus or in a local library. Replicate those things too. And then, of course, test format, timing, and restrictions. So I even encourage people, if you're going to do 10 questions a day or 20 questions a day or whatever, don't do them in that mode where you get to find out if you got it right or wrong instantly. Do blocks of questions where you have to not know until the end of that block which ones you got right and which ones you got wrong. If you experience test anxiety, this can be it can be maddening to suddenly go 7 hours without knowing what you're getting right and what you're getting wrong. So you want to create even short stretches that replicate the actual conditions of the exam. That's super important. Now, remember, you might mess around and get an interview and start from the beginning of this application process, assuming that somebody's going to want to interview you. And instead of thinking, I'll cross that, if you experience social anxiety, if you're an introvert, instead of thinking, I'll cross that bridge when I get to it, I just can't handle it now. Trust yourself that you can handle it and start to do little things while you're studying and focused on the MCAT that will also be little steps to expose yourself to that discomfort that will come with the interview. So I recommend things like if you happen to be on a Zoom where they give you control over your video and you usually just kind of sit it out, turn your video on, right? Because if you're going to have video interviews and you're going to have to sit there and look at yourself, you don't want to be that to be the first time that you've been doing that. So make sure you practice finding the camera, like looking actually where you want to be looking in your interviews, and you're practicing that actual mechanics of it and not just planning to do it on test day. And then talk to strangers is always good advice, right? Go around and tell people, at the grocery store, at your mama's house, why you want to be a physician. Right? And we don't want to get superstitious about it as you're in the application process. In fact, you want to be practicing something that is authentic and that allows you to sort of put yourself out there in the way you have to on the interview. And then when you're going to do an interview, if you have someone who's willing, support folks at school, pre-med advisors, friends who are willing to do practice interviews with you, make sure that you set a certain amount of time that the interview is going to last, or that you plan to do it until you no longer feel anxious. Don't let anxiety determine when you tap out, because you can't do that in your real interview. And don't let it be, I'm going to keep repeating myself until I get it right, and that's when it's over. Keep trying until the anxiety naturally goes down because you've shown it's not dangerous, or in a fixed amount of time, because that's not determined by the anxiety, so it doesn't reinforce it. All right. And I see we have some hands up too. Should we take some hands? What do you guys think? Samantha, do you want to, actually, how do I let you off? I don't know if I can let you off mute. We're going to have our production folks in the background investigate this. But keep putting questions and in the chat and in the Q&A, and we'll take as many as we can at the end. Some questions we might get to in this next part. Okay. So that's the B part of it. And honestly, the B part of it is huge when it comes to test prep. When we talk about people who are quote unquote bad test takers, that doesn't mean there's something inherently problematic about them. They'll never be able to get a good score. It means that whatever plan you develop for the test, you need to be able to use well on test day and be comfortable with and stick to and not abandon, right? And so when we reduce anxiety, sometimes those scores go up, which means, was that a bad test taker, right? If I tell you that C is not a more common answer, and then you just get a couple points back, was that ever a bad test taker, or was that just someone who needed to adapt some strategies? So The cognitive part in CBT, the thing to do if you're really worried about the MCAT, if you're really worried in the process about not getting into med school, if it's very much you're staying up at night, this is going to be the part that's big bang for your buck, right? There are a lot of people who are great test takers who, again, white knuckle it through it, and we don't want that either. So I'm going to say a little bit about the cognitive approach to reducing anxiety. And this is kind of one of those amazing things in psychology where there's a very basic idea that is the whole ball game, right? And here's what it is. So, and a lot of you have probably heard the cognitive model, but in general in life, we go around with this narrative. Things happen, and that's why I feel and behave in certain ways, right? Somebody cut me off, and that's why I have road rage, right? My dad is in this car being a mess, and that's why Lisa Simpson's embarrassed, right? We talk about life just this way constantly. The cognitive model says, okay, if you're having feelings and behaviors you don't want, you've got to stop talking to yourself that way, right? Things happen. We tell ourselves stories about it. We have automatic thoughts, beliefs, and interpretations, and those things are the drivers of our feelings and behaviors. And this is great news because we have access to our thoughts, beliefs, and interpretations, and we are not obligated to them. In this model, our ideas about ourselves and about our performance and about the world are just tools to get the behaviors we want from ourselves and the feelings we need to survive whatever experience we're in, like the admissions process. So you're not obligated to decide to sort of accept that you may never get into med school. If it's a helpful idea in your head in some way to get you to study that day, even though shame and guilt are not motivators, if it's a helpful idea in your head, then the thought is helpful. If it's unhelpful, you're not obligated to it. There's no right or true in CBT. So what do you do when you identify a thought as unhelpful, a theme as sort of making you not motivated, as sort of challenging your decision making when you're trying to identify a right answer? Here are our steps, and I'll go through these quickly and then show an example. Identify unhelpful thoughts. So there's a million different ways. Let me take this back. If you've ever done CBT or if you have ever been a provider or therapist, there's so many different ways to do this, right? There's so many different approaches, exercises to do this. This is one that I like that sort of gets at that is easy, that kind of gets at some of the main shared tools in CBT. The main thing is just to pick something that makes sense to you and keep drilling it so that your brain starts to understand that it can do this automatically. First is to identify unhelpful thoughts. And these are some unhelpful thoughts, again, from a step one kind of webinar. But in these unhelpful thoughts, they fly by. If you watch cable news like I do, it's like a chyron in our brains all the time. We don't really even consciously listen to them, but we can slow them down and look at them. We are the foremost experts in the scary stories and nasty things we say to ourselves, right? So if we slow down and look directly at it, we can identify these unhelpful thoughts, and that's step one. The second is to ask a version of this question that people think therapists ask a lot. How does that make you feel? But we add the nuance of how does that thought make you feel? If a thought makes you feel a way that you don't want to feel, right? You don't want to feel shame. You don't want to feel fear when you need to do that set of practice questions or you need to go and do that extra chem studying. If it makes you feel a way that you don't want to feel, especially in the short term to get what you need to get done, that means that there's something wrong with the thought. Thoughts aren't inherently neutral. In order to create negative feelings, even in a very demanding process, there's some cognitive distortion involved. This is Simone Biles doing a Simone Biles because it's mental gymnastics. So there's all different kinds of ways cognitive distortions have been characterized. I'm just going to introduce you to a couple. And it's important to hold our thoughts to a standard and to be able to put language on the cognitive distortion as a way of getting your brain to think this way in an automatic way. So fortune telling, I'm going to throw up during the cars section or run out of time, something less dramatic, tends to have a catastrophe underlying it, right? We run around trying to predict things. And what we're saying to ourselves all the time is actually our secret worst outcome. So you want to make sure you're identifying the fortune-telling part and the catastrophe as you're getting deeper and deeper into this process of admissions. Mind reading. So fortune telling and catastrophizing, we can't literally tell the future. We can't literally tell what anyone's thinking. But when we get really anxious, we suddenly think we can. And it's usually not very kind if it's going to be an unhelpful thought. And then we have another set of things that really try to split the world into a place that narrows our outcomes, our safety. So categorical thinking. I'm a bad test taker. There are good test takers. There are bad test takers. As long as I'm a bad test taker, I'm not going to get into the school I want. I'm not going to be able to have the same kind, I have to have 10 times more extracurriculars than other people. I'm probably gonna struggle on my board exams, right? I'm gonna be miserable. Categorical thinking. When it's unhelpful, we put ourselves in this rigid category. Now, this is also labeling. I cannot Google who are the bad test takers because it is not a real thing. It's not a construct. In my discipline, it's just a label we like to use when to characterize, unfortunately, ourselves quite often. And then there's this other world of cognitive distortion that is focused on things that are true but unhelpful. Right? You might not sleep a hot wink before your MCAT, the night before your real MCAT. It is really, really difficult to not be able to dine out on the adrenaline, right, that you have stored up for that test. I have met a handful of people who doze off, but not that many. And so I know people are tired and have to keep their caffeine up and all that kind of stuff. But if you have a well-practiced plan for the test, that plan will be concrete enough that you can execute it even if you're tired, and the adrenaline itself will get you through. More importantly, it's hard to answer the question while you're thinking about not having enough sleep. So this is just an example of what this might look like on paper to make the point that you've got to put it on paper. You don't fight anxiety where she lives and dances and has her best life. You fight anxiety in a place where you can structure and win. So this is a worksheet that has those first 3 steps: unhelpful thoughts. For example, most of the questions are trick questions on purpose, right? If anybody's out there starting to feel a lot of animosity about the test itself, that can be anxiety sort of feeding this helplessness narrative. I'll never be a doctor. I have no idea. Now, this is a thought you have when you look at an item. This idea, I have no idea. So let's think about feelings and emotions, and feel free to put some in the chat for I'll never be a doctor. How does that thought make you feel right now in this moment as you sit here on our webinar? Immediately sad, right? Stressed, terrible, discouraging in the morning, disgusted. Okay, well, y'all got a lot, all the words, right? Heartbreak, anguish. You are up early in this morning on this webinar, registered for this for a reason, and that thought lurking around the back of your head is a lot, right? I have no idea. This is a thought that we often have when we're trying to problem solve. I don't know. I didn't study this. I can't do this. I have no idea is something that anxious brains love to conclude. Even though it feels really bad, it feels like what? Certainty. So I have no idea is something that can make us feel confused. Here are some ways that these can be characterized from a cognitive distortion kind of perspective. So mind reading, most of the questions are trick questions on purpose. Again, I'm not trying to defend the test creators too much, although I really appreciate them hosting me. But getting into their heads instead of answering questions is a little bit different. I'll never be a doctor, that fortune-telling, catastrophizing piece. And then I have no idea is something that's extra deleterious on multiple choice questions, and we'll talk about why. So step 4, which I'm just going to kind of describe, is to dispute unhelpful thoughts. And I feel like I'm a super user of ChatGPT, and it's not coming for your jobs. It might come for mine because ChatGPT can do some disputes of some unhelpful thoughts, right? So if you're ever struggling with these steps, you can also kind of engage that resource. But you don't let anxiety have a conversation with you that you just kind of follow it around and say, but I hope not, I hope not. You want to dispute unhelpful thoughts in an aggressive way. Now, this is dating myself too, but this is the so-called dream team. That is Johnny Cochran's, right there, and F. Gleason somewhere up there. All these are defense attorneys who aren't, their job isn't to let people chat on the stand about what they believe. It's to back folks' logic down and be critical and chip away at it until it is kind of meaningless, right? And so step 4 is when we challenge those unhelpful thoughts. We've established that they're unhelpful. We know why, and we just aggressively go after them. And then we choose more helpful thoughts. And I was going to give a little bit of an example here, but one of the most helpful, I can just disappear. One of the most fun rational responses I've heard is from Venus Williams, who was talking about anxiety for these tennis press conferences. And she said, I just come out, I tell myself that none of y'all can play as good as I can. Anybody asking these questions. So yeah, that's what I do to manage my nerves before press conferences. Super funny. But you'll have to come up with your own ones that make sense for you. Here's some examples that I've heard from folks. I don't have to be perfect. And that is actually literally true when we talk about scaled scores on standardized tests. Feeling anxious doesn't equal failing or even bad performance. Remember, physiological anxiety is very different from behavioral choices made as a result of anxiety. And then I can find wrong answers. And I love this one because it's instructive for how you behave on the test. Okay. Here's an example of, I'm actually going to go here, an MCAT question popping up and how a unhelpful thought like I'm not ready, I have no idea, can cascade into feelings and behaviors that aren't helpful and that actually can affect your score. Rereading the question over and over again, guessing instead of process of elimination. If we start from a place of something simple, right? Not a, I'm perfect, I'm going to be, the best, I'm going to graduate #1 in my med school class. Rational responses are not Pollyannish. They're not equally distorted. They're just a little bit more rational. So the correct answers here might lead you to engage the question a little bit more. And importantly, it can help you narrow down your choices, just find 1 or 2 wrong answers, that tremendously increases your likelihood of getting that answer right, which over time affects your score, over items affects your scores. Quote unquote, good test takers are not people who instantly know every right answer. They repeatedly narrow it down to 2 choices and often increase their likelihood of getting the right choice just by doing that, getting the right answer just by doing that. So it's not always knowing the right answer. It's narrowing down choices over and over again that equates to success on multiple choice test. So I'm running a little bit long, but we're going to land this plane and have in the next 2 minutes, and we're going to have time for Q&A. But I got to tell you all about Ellen. We got to revisit this. Remember these choices? Mild medication, keep studying, use grounding techniques. We're going to go through each of these. Anxiety reducing medication. Is it going to reduce anxiety in the moment? Yes, probably. Is it likely to have some kind of even anxiety dose for a long test like this? Probably not. But more importantly, once you're done with your MCAT, when you get to step 1, you're going to still be feeling like test caused panic, and you have to figure out what to do. Panic's dangerous, and you're not dead. The message to your brain, your cave brain, is that you're not dead due to this kind of avoidance. So in this particular circumstance, where you're signing up for a lifetime of multiple choice test, it might be less helpful. Y'all liked B, bathroom water splashing and breathing, these grounding techniques. There's likely to be a temporary decrease when you get up and go to the bathroom and manage your breathing and get away from that test. But what you're learning is that the test itself is dangerous, or leads to panic, and panic itself is dangerous. And your brain says, okay, I've got to do this safety strategy in order to maintain my survival, right? And the only reason I'm safe is because I had that temporary experience of avoidance. Now, this is fun, right? I love to explain a nervous system. I love to talk about autonomic nervous system. I just did it to you all, right? And as a strategy combined with other things, this is not a bad idea. But your anxiety is smarter than that. It will override this sort of, don't worry, you're fine. It's just your brain being scary. Anxiety will say, yeah, but you've got to work hard to avoid how uncomfortable you are. And if we gave Ellen this advice and she left the situation, her anxiety would immediately go down and it would be super, super reinforced, right? And so when we have these experiences of avoidance of things that aren't dangerous and our brain gets flooded with that relief, it makes it much less likely that we'll be able to, we start from a different place when we're challenging that anxiety. Practice intentionally hyperventilating. I saw a couple folks say this, and I'm sure a lot of folks were like very averse to that. This is when you say CBT works for anxiety, this is what we're talking about. This is what exposure is, and I'm sure you've heard that term. But if your fear is of physiological sensations, you have to show your cave brain that they're not dangerous. So intentionally overbreathing, hyperventilating in a controlled way. I like coffee straws. And you just kind of do it for a set time trial over and over and over again. Your brain gets kind of bored. And it's like, okay, if I'm doing it on purpose, it's probably not that dangerous. And then on the test day, when you have that sudden tightness in your chest, you have that difficulty breathing, but you've been doing that before, practicing before, your brain remembers. So avoidance is driving anxiety. Anxiety does not persist without avoidance. And if we can reduce avoidance, we can actually extinguish anxious responses to specific things that then can generalize to anxious responses overall. This is especially relevant to physiological sensations, but you can also expose yourself to your fears. So maybe hurtful, hurtful-ish, probably hurtful and costly, valid, helpful CBT. What about everybody's favorite E? That is Freud. Now, Freud, I'm not going to go on my sort of soapbox about it, but this whole idea of getting to the root of anxiety, remember, you're a human. That's where it came from. That's why it's there. You're a high achiever. You're anticipating the future. You might have some perfectionists in your life. You don't really need to get too far into it. The question is, what would make it stop? Have a plan that overrides anxiety. I like to say prophylactic save lives, right? So challenging and choosing your thoughts ahead of time. You can do that. You don't have to wait for the anxiety to sneak up on you. And then I just want to remind you as we go to some Q&A here, my anesthesiologist, when I was getting my epidural several years ago, was just chatting up about his test anxiety, right? So you are going to be able to manage anxiety and have the career that you want. It is not something that makes you a bad doctor, and it's not something that has to determine your future and that you need to work hard to avoid. Go directly, edit, stay in the arena if it matters to you, because anxiety doesn't need to hijack your admissions or your career. All right, we landed that plane, kind of. And I know a lot of folks need a break before the next session. So I appreciate people hanging in there.
Thank you so much for that amazing wealth of knowledge that you've just delivered. I have been seeing so many comments in the chat, so many messages coming through. This crowd is really feeling it. We do have time for an expedited Q&A session, so I'll dive right into it. Let me get to some of them. We have everything from overarching themes to nitty-gritty, specific questions about strategies on the day of the MCAT, things like that. So I'm going to start with this one here. The individual says, I have ADHD and a lot of my anxiety comes from that. I don't have extended time, so I can't take the exam at my own pace. For neurodivergent individuals who have not been helped by those exam accommodations, what advice do you recommend?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And it's so important to me to make sure that any strategies we provide are consistent with, you have to assume that there is some neurodivergence, especially on board. And so practicing strategies in a routine, structured way is one of the best things you can do if you experience test anxiety and ADHD, and challenging your thoughts, right? So there's a lot, we know that once you have that idea that you have ADHD, and so therefore everyone knows you're a bull in a china shop, and you have to, a lot of people have beliefs about needing to do things at the last minute and all this kind of stuff. All of those thoughts can be challenged. You are not obligated to beat yourself up if you are carrying a diagnosis, and you can succeed without some accommodations by creating these rules for yourself and being strong, like hard about it when you're doing your practice test. So I will say anxiety doesn't care how much extra time you have, by the way. It's happy to wait around and to make things messy all along. So challenge the thoughts about the challenges that you're experiencing, and definitely create structure. Behavioral management, that's the name of the game in ADHD.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, we have another one that's a little more about the nitty-gritty of some test-taking strategies. So I'm going to share two that I think are a little bit related. Someone wants to know, what is your opinion on highlighting? Isn't it anticipating answers in a way? Also, do you recommend reading the question before the passage?
Okay, highlighting. So this actually dovetails nicely to the previous question. A lot of people highlight as a way of staying engaged with the reading. And I think that's great, right? Like sometimes if you're having trouble focusing, you should actually put your finger up on the screen as you're reading, maybe even move your mouth. But don't worry about everybody else in the testing center, they're fine. Kind of if you want to whisper it a little bit out loud to yourself, there's physical ways to engage yourself in the reading. And sometimes highlighting can be that mechanism. So it's not necessarily, a bad habit. Um, if you are highlighting in order to anticipate, if you're highlighting inconsistently, then it becomes more problematic, right? Like if you're not highlighting when you're taking routine practice questions, and then all of a sudden when you take a full-length practice test, you're highlighting a whole bunch, that's problematic. So, highlighting, it just depends on how consistent you are about it and the function that it feels that it's serving for you. I think the next question, what was the next question?
Do you recommend reading the question before the passage?
Now, so if a passage has like 5 questions associated with it, don't read all the questions before the passage. But there is an argument to be made that you can read the lead in, the question first, before you do the passage. And that actually works in sections other than just cars as well, where you figure out what it's asking, and then you go to all of the information that's going to have the important stuff and the confusing stuff in it all together. I'm of the opinion that you should never fully skip a passage. But if you go into it with um, some sort of strategy, then yes, it's reasonable to read the question before. Once you get to USMLE exams, always read the lead in before you read the STEM.
Okay, thank you. We've got another one here. Do you have any suggestions for things that can be done during the break times to help alleviate anxiety?
Whatever it is, practice it during your full-length practice test. So some people you can get your phone back, I think, when you have break time. Do not look up stuff from previous sections or try to do any extra studying at that point. Sometimes people warm up their brain with a question or two, that's fine, but I wouldn't try to renegotiate. Oh, they say you cannot get your phone back. Okay. I know that's some limited exams. All right, so whatever you're going to do during the practice test, somebody said push-ups near the bathroom. I love that because it just circulates your your energy. I think it's perfectly fine to stand up and literally be actively trying to hype yourself up if you're tired. That's something you do. If you're a stretcher, some people sit still, right? If you doodle, whatever it is, test it out when you're doing full-length practice test. Do not give your phone back to yourself when you're taking that practice test, even that first one that I know you all take this week.
Okay, I think we have time for two more. And here's one I think a lot of people can relate to. Any suggestions for what to do on the day of the exam when my mind just goes blank?
Oh, so first challenge that thought, right? the feeling that your mind has gone blank is it's not something that will last forever, and not something that that you can't override, right? So if you feel like your mind is going blank, and you're reading, that's a good time to pull out your finger and start to um, practice engaging your attention in that way. This is another reason why it's super important to try to make your practice test as realistic as possible, because your goal is to elicit that moment where you're like, oh my God, I just can't think of an answer, right? Or I just can't figure this out, right? My recommendation is to lean more into the material, to start explaining to yourself what you do know um, when you feel like you're at a point where you don't know anything, right? The tests have lots of words on them. There's going to be something that you do know. And so start to explain to yourself what you do know so that you can kind of lubricate that brain into getting back into the moment. But it's not possible for your brain to go blank and to block off information that you have access to for 6 hours or 7 hours or even 6 or 7 minutes. It's a fear we have.
Thank you. Okay, this last one I think is a great one to end on. So the individual says, the truth is, this is the most important test of our lives. It determines if we get in, if we get scholarships. Sometimes it determines whether or not our application gets seen because some schools will screen out certain scores. It can be really challenging to ground and focus. How can we manage the reality of this and prepare well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that having a plan and making a plan and making a list and having things that you know at least you can do that is one way to stay sort of on the ground instead of in the clouds of like, oh my God, like this could go so wrong. What, it is a big deal, but it's also just like, when am I going to sit in the chair and answer the questions? When am I going to build my flashcards? What resources are helpful? Which ones aren't? Am I studying too late at night? Is that actually getting, it's just constant low grade problem solving, looking up to think about, oh my gosh, the big threat of it every once in a while. But if you're doing that too much, get down into the nitty gritty problem solving of it all. It's not sexy work, ultimately. It's really sort of brass tacks. And that can help you know that you're leaving it all on the field, as I say.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Hunter, for
Yeah, I'm happy to lurk around a
sharing.
little bit if it helps.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I know I learned a ton. I think all of our attendees can attest to the same. Just a couple things before we wrap up. We do have another session that's starting at 12:15 that's called Watch What Happens Live, Medical School Mock Interviews. One of our most popular. Definitely catch that out. I saw some questions in the chat. You will actually need to leave this Zoom meeting link and then enter into the other one in order to join. But I'm just overwhelmed at the positive feedback and all the questions that we didn't get to. I'm so sorry. If you have more MCAT related questions, you can visit the AAMC in our booth tomorrow, anytime between 11 a.m. and 7 p.m. Eastern. We will certainly have another session like this again, and we can perhaps offer some extended time to get to some more of those questions. But for now, just want to thank everyone so much for coming and sharing your insight and participating. And I will see you at the next session at 12:15.
All right, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.